It's back to the White House for the former vice president. His opponent may be refusing to accept defeat, but Joe Biden has been elected by the American people. How did he secure victory, and can he now unite a divided nation? I'm Ali Aslan, and today's newsmaker is the next U.S. president. After 3 decades and 3 previous attempts, Joe Biden has finally done it. A record-breaking election saw more than 150 million Americans vote, and the majority backed the former vice president. But victory was not as sweet as the Democrats had hoped. The pollsters predicted a landslide, but Donald Trump defied the odds to get more than 70 million votes. That's more than he got in 2016. But it wasn't enough. And despite the incumbent's legal challenges, come January, Joe Biden will very likely be inaugurated as the 46th president of the United States. So, how did he do it? Natalie Pohonen explores.
We must restore the soul of America. Our nation is shaped by the constant battle between our better angels and our darkest impulses. And what presidents say in this battle matters. It's time for our better angels to prevail.
A prayer for unity after a bitter campaign. It has taken a broad church of supporters to send Joe Biden and his running mate Kamala Harris on their way to the White House. She paid tribute to the generations of women who have come before her.
Women who fought and sacrificed so much for equality and liberty and justice for all, including the black women who are too often overlooked, but so often prove they are the backbone of our democracy.
America remains a nation divided by the ballot box. Biden secured enough votes to win the all-important Electoral College, but there was no blue wave. While he received more votes than any US presidential candidate in history, President Donald Trump finished the race with the second highest number. He is not conceding defeat, and his campaign has launched a series of legal challenges. Here's how the US electoral map looks now. Much of Biden's support came from black voters, women and suburban voters. Black voters make up about 11% of the electorate, and 9 in 10 backed Biden, helping to turn battleground states like Pennsylvania blue. More women supported Biden over Trump, and in the suburbs, Biden had an overall lead. Young voters, particularly voters of color, were also key. In the Midwest state of Michigan, 62% of them supported Biden. Nationally, more 18 to 29-year-olds voted in this election than in 2016. A concerted effort was made by progressive organizations to guarantee a high turnout. In Georgia, which is going to a recount, about 800,000 new voters were registered. Democrat Stacey Abrams, who led the charge there, has been hailed by the party. 6 in 10 Biden voters said the coronavirus pandemic was the most important issue. Climate change and racism were also concerns. Trump voters tended to put a higher priority on the economy. Biden has already convened a meeting of his coronavirus task force, and it will be top of the agenda when he's set to assume office in January. For many Americans, this election was a referendum on the incumbent. After 4 tumultuous and divisive years in US politics, President-elect Joe Biden says it's time to lower the temperature. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in St. Paul, Minnesota is law professor Richard Painter. He's the former chief White House ethics lawyer who worked in the George W. administration. John Brabender is in Washington, D.C. He's a Republican strategist and former senior advisor for Rick Santorum's presidential campaigns. And in New York, we have Shana Gadarian. She's an associate professor of political science at Syracuse University and author of Anxious Politics, Democratic Citizenship in a Threatening World. Richard, Donald Trump to this day still refuses to concede, still talks of voter fraud. You are an experienced lawyer and a White House insider. Any chance, any legal path that Donald Trump, the president, still has of turning this around?
No, the lawsuits that have been filed are frivolous, and it's quite clear that Joe Biden is the president-elect. This does not mean that the Republican Party will not continue to be a very viable political force in the United States. The Republicans control the Senate, and they can certainly field very strong candidates in 2022 and a presidential candidate in 2024. But it's critically important to move on and for the Republican Party to show that it is committed to American democracy and to the votes that were cast, including the mail-in votes. And every American has the right to vote. And the decision has been made, but there will be future elections. And I trust the Republican Party will support our democracy rather than Donald Trump's frivolous claims in his litigation and his tweets. And quite frankly, his continuing to dismantle the United States government. We've had 4 people leave the Department of Defense, some of them fired. This is a very bad situation for the United States and our national security. And having been a Republican for 30 years and a member of the Bush White House team, I hope that our party can come back to a commitment to our country, to our democracy, not to a single individual who envisions himself as a strong man in the presidency.
It's time to move on for the Republicans, says Richard. But John, some of the most prominent Republicans have no intentions of moving on. As a matter of fact, Senate Leader Mitch McConnell is saying Donald Trump has every right to pursue legal challenges. The Attorney General, Bill Barr, has just given the go-ahead to the Justice Department to investigate alleged vote irregularities. Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo, as a matter of fact, yesterday said he's looking forward to a transition into a second Trump term. What do you make of these statements on the part of prominent Republican politicians?
Yeah, first of all, people have to understand a couple things. This is about more than just this particular election. Number one, there was a certain amount of fraud. We know this because a number of people who are deceased somehow showed up and voted. And so, but the Democrats are quick to say, yeah, but that's not 50,000 votes in Pennsylvania, but there should be no fraud. So Republicans want to make sure we understand why there was fraud and how we're going to get rid of it. Second of all, people have to understand we changed the entire voting system this time. It was mail coming in early, mail coming in on election day. In Pennsylvania, mail even allowed to come in for 5 days after the election. You had people who could then also show up on election day. So it was a very, very complicated system, which I believe leads to a tremendous amount of inefficiencies and the possibility of big mistakes. With that said, even if it isn't going to change the outcome of the presidential election, 2 things. Before we ever do that again in the future, certainly we should take the time to say what happened. Was it accurate? Did every legal vote count? And were there illegal votes that counted? Second of all, that could also affect the Georgia runoff, where you had one candidate get, 49.50% of the vote. If he would have got 50%, there would be no runoff for him. So between inefficiencies and fraud, that's not a big number to make up. So I guess the question that a lot of Republicans are asking Democrats is, if you're so comfortable in the belief of the results, what is the downside of doing audits and doing recounts in closed states if you're so comfortable that the results are going to show the same thing?
Shana, John just repeated the claim that the president is making and his supporters that there have been voter fraud, saying dead people have voted in Nevada. There have been computer glitches that turned out in favor of Joe Biden. What do you make of these allegations?
Well, I think there's no evidence for those allegations. If you look at the New York Times this morning, they did a huge audit they called and interviewed election officials in every state. And there's essentially, to this point, no evidence of any kind of voter fraud, any large-scale voter fraud, anything that would overcome an election of this size. And in states where there are recounts and they are by law, they're going to happen anyway. There is auditing across all these states. I think the reason the Republican Party at this point is not conceding defeat is for the presidency is, one, to keep excitement about the Senate runoffs in January, and 2, because there is a concern, I think, that the president is going to affect their kind of primary challenges in 2022 and 2024, that he still holds a very important part in the party right now. But I agree with Richard that it's better for the party to move on and think about how to build broader and better for the next round of elections in January and in 2022. And that these kind of baseless accusations of electoral fraud do a lot of damage to the public's belief in the electoral system and in democracy itself. And that is extremely damaging to our democracy.
Clearly, Richard, Donald Trump's legal team will do anything at least until December 8th, because that's the deadline for legal challenges, to pursue this track and see if there'll be some developments. But one thing is for certain, this has not been the landslides victory that Democrats had both predicted and hoped for. As a matter of fact, more than 70 million Americans voted for Donald Trump, and that in times of a very deadly pandemic. So the nation is divided as ever, is it not?
Yes, it is. I was a Republican for 30 years. I left the Republican Party in 2018 because I can't accept Donald Trump. And I will remind everyone that in 2016, the vast majority of Republican officials rejected Donald Trump as an unethical man who did not deserve the Republican nomination. Now, I know everyone's been kowtowing to him since he won the election because he's been president. But this has been a disaster under Donald Trump. And I believe a lot more people were casting votes to get rid of Donald Trump rather than in favor of a particular agenda. Now, that being said, Joe Biden is a very well-respected man who was a very effective vice president for 8 years. I think people like Joe Biden. He appeals to the center in the United States. We'll see what he does. But the Republican Party does have a future. Once again, yes, focus on fair voting, and voter fraud is an issue, but if voter fraud takes place on both sides and did not affect this election, the Republican Party needs to accept the results of the election, focus on the Georgia runoffs, focus on the next elections, and yes, work with other groups to assure that there is fair voting when we vote by mail and that it is effective, that every legal vote is counted. But Donald Trump is leaving the White House on January 20, and Republican leaders who refuse to accept that are making this situation a lot worse and are really going to hurt the Republican candidates in the Georgia runoffs and moving forward.
John, do you think that the president's refusal to concede is undermining the belief on the part of many Americans, 71 million in this particular case, their belief in America's democratic institutions?
Well, I do think that we have to be very careful with the rhetoric. I think it's fair to say all the Republicans want is to make sure every vote that should have counted, counted, every vote that shouldn't have counted, doesn't, and move on from there. I think, though, to go beyond that is probably wrong. But I got to point out one thing. When we start talking about Trump versus Republicans, the Republicans actually had a pretty darn good night on election night. They actually did extremely well in the House of Representatives, much better than anybody anticipated. They won some tough Senate races that nobody thought they were going to win, and highly likely going to maintain the majority in the Senate. And so, I think certainly there was a certain amount of this being a referendum on Donald Trump more than it was Republican. And whether or not Trump ends up being victorious after a recount, Republicans can feel pretty good about their results in all the other races on election night.
And indeed, Shana, the Senate will stay in the hands of Republicans. As a matter of fact, they gained some votes in the House. They narrowly got beaten for the White House. So Donald Trump may go on January the 20th, but Trumpism is here to stay, is it not?
Well, I think it's an open question as whether or not the party stays the party of Trump into the future. And there may be some unique appeal that Trump has in his kind of bombacity and the ways in which he makes people feel a part of kind of a movement in ways that may not be replicable for other candidates. That doesn't mean that other Republicans won't necessarily be successful, But I think the gains that the Republican Party saw in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas and in southern Florida with Latinx voters shows a pathway for the Republican Party, if they want to grow in different directions outside of Trumpism, to grow with perhaps more socially conservative voters of color. I think that is one of the stories of the night. I will also say that I don't think this kind of idea that Democrats underperformed is quite right. So the Senate may or may not stay in Republican hands. We don't know that until January. It is true that the polling was did not do great with some of the Senate races, and some of that I think is about late decisions that people made to perhaps balance their ticket between the president and the Senate races. And some of that is that some of the senators who are more kind of Republican moderates, like Susan Collins, did better than the top of the ticket. So I think the polling was off, but I don't necessarily think that means that Democrats underperformed. I think that we just need better kind of sampling for our electoral polls.
Right, and as a matter of fact, Richard, Joe Biden did win the popular vote with 4 or 5 million votes in between, so that can be counted as decisive. Let's move on from the controversy surrounding the election process and move on and look at what a Biden presidency mean for both the United States and the rest of the world. Let's start at home. As we said, this is the politically divided nation, and Joe Biden, the oldest president, he'll be oldest president ever to enter the White House at 78. He has his work cut out for himself, does he not? We're still in the midst of a pandemic. He did get a little boost, though, with the announcement of a vaccine, did he not?
Yes, he has a lot of work to do here. We are in the middle of a pandemic. We did not respond well to the pandemic. The number of coronavirus cases in the United States and deaths far exceeds other industrial countries per capita. The situation has been very badly managed. Donald Trump turned it over to his son, Jared Kushner, who absolutely knew nothing about what was going on. It made it even worse. So there's a lot of work to be done here. And I hope that President-elect Biden can work with Republicans and independents and confront the pandemic. There's nothing political. There should be nothing political about addressing a pandemic of this sort and responding and protecting the lives of Americans, just as there's nothing political when we're in a war. We're in this together, and we need to unify our country and cut out the partisan rhetoric, at least on this issue. Come together, and I trust that Joe Biden can do it. But that's the number one priority, and that's what's destroying our economy right now is the pandemic. So if we address the pandemic as quickly as we can, get a vaccine rolled out, we're going to be able to restore our economy so they can move on together as a country.
Indeed, John, the pandemic, the economy, racial unrest in the United States, no lack of challenges here for Biden. Do you think he's the man, he's the president, together with Kamala Harris, of course, who can unite this nation in the next coming 4 years?
Well, here's what a lot of Republicans are watching is really who is the Democrat Party these days. We saw what we call the Socialist Squad, the left-leaning socialists of the Democrat Party led by AOC. Yesterday, AOC attacked Biden for some of the people Biden were thinking about coming into the administration. One of the other members of the squad attacked Democrat Senator Joe Manchin when Joe Manchin said, I am not going to support packing the Supreme Court. I'm not going to change the filibuster rules. And so you're already seeing this battle within the Democrat Party between the centrists and the far left socialists in there. And there's a lot of people that believe that it's the socialists that are going to win out in that battle. And so we're still trying to figure out who the Democrat Party is, quite frankly.
Shana, we just saw for a year and a half, the election was branded the battle for America's soul. Are we going to see the next 4 years the battle for the for the soul of the Democratic Party?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's quite clear who the Democratic Party is right now, which both has a left flank and has a large centrist moderate wing that is now in charge of I don't think anyone thinks that Nancy Pelosi is part of the squad, right? Chuck Schumer is really more kind of in the middle of the party. All of the people that Biden-Harris are putting as and part of their leadership teams that they've announced already are really kind of in the middle of the party. Yeah, I mean, there are progressives in the party and they're making demands, but this kind of idea that the squad, these four women of color who are sophomore members of the House of Representatives are somehow taking over this kind of large tent party, I think is not quite right. I think the Democratic Party is going to have to figure out, because of the way the government is divided, it's going to have to figure out how to work with Republicans and a Democratic White House to try and get major legislation passed. And it will be different kind of legislation that Biden-Harris administration would have been able to pass had they taken the Senate and the House by large margins. Things that people were talking about before the election, like packing the courts and getting rid of the filibuster. Those things are off the table because the margins, even if the Democrats win 2 seats in Georgia, the margins in the House are going to be, in the Senate are going to be split. So. Right. We're going to have to see compromise across the parties because of the way government is divided. But there's still a lot that the Biden-Harris administration is going to be able to do by executive order that's already been talked about. Right.
A lot will depend, of course, on how the president-elect will get on with his former colleague in the Senate, Mitch McConnell. Richard, let's talk briefly at the end of the show about the United States and the rest of the world. Obviously, many countries, there was a sigh of relief that Joe Biden actually got elected. Is this the end of America First?
I hope so. The first America First movement, by the way, was in the 1930s and early 40s, supported by people who didn't want us to fight fascism in Nazi Germany and enter World War II. There's a very, very tragic history of the so-called first America First movement. What this is about isn't ideology. We have 2 political parties with a left wing of the Democratic Party, a centrist wing of the Democratic Party, a very conservative wing of the Republican Party, and moderates. But up until Donald Trump came along, the vast majority of people all along that political spectrum, including the most conservative Republicans, believed in American democracy, believed in truth and in facts, and did not kowtow to racism and did not kowtow to demagoguery. With Donald Trump, what we see is what has appeared in other countries with a strong man, the Mussolini, the Adolf Hitler. We see this in many other countries today. This is what is very dangerous, is the use of racism, the use of attacks, vicious attacks on political opponents, threatening to put opponents in jail. This is not how democracies work. This has nothing to do with political ideology. And I believe the rest of the world is to see the United States turn to the group of democratic nations who are committed to the rule of law.
And John, Joe Biden has already said that under him, the U.S. will rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, will rejoin the World Health Organization. Will we see an America that will assume leadership again in this world? Because America has been quite detached from world affairs in the previous 4 years, has it not?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think there's a lot of Americans that thought for a long time we were getting sand kicked in our face, that we were, as President Obama called it, leading from behind. Bad trade deals, what they believed were unfair green deals where America had to pay a higher price than anybody else. And this is something to keep in mind. There are a lot of people who may not have voted for President Trump, but they actually agree with his agenda, number one. Number two, this isn't just Republican or Democrat. President Trump did very well, even though he didn't win it in all the Rust Belt states, which are Democrat states. And you can only do that if a lot of Democrats are voting for you. These are what we actually used to call Reagan Democrats. And now these are the sons and daughters of Reagan Democrats who sort of agree with President Trump's agenda. That doesn't mean they always agree with his rhetoric or style or tone or tenor, but in many cases, they do agree with his agenda. And that's quite frankly why the Democrats are now struggling in states that they should be doing much better.
Right. Shana, 30 seconds until we wrap up. I know not a lot of time, but give me your sense about the foreign policy challenges and the foreign policy president that Joe Biden can and will be.
Sure, I think Joe Biden has a lot of experience in foreign policy, and will be a return to normalcy, which is America as part of the World Forum and its cooperation with other nations, a return to kind of our bilateral trade relationships and multilateral trade relationships with other countries. I think you'll see joining things like the TPP again and Paris climate. So I think you're going to just see more cooperation with foreign leaders.
More cooperation and perhaps a softer tone. Richard Painter, John Brabender, and Shana Gadarian, thank you so much for joining us. The president has not conceded yet, but this time is running out. Thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you again next time when we're back with a new edition of Newsmakers.